The air in the briefing room was a manufactured sterility, scrubbed of all scent, all life. It tasted of recycled oxygen and cold metal, a flavor Captain Kalen Valerius had long ago learned to associate with purpose. He stood at parade rest, his spine a column of disciplined steel, his gaze fixed on the holographic display shimmering in the center of the obsidian table. The schematics of the Citadel's sub-level gamma twisted in silent, blue-lit perfection. His uniform, the severe gray of the Enforcer Corps, was a second skin, its high collar a constant, subtle pressure against his throat, a reminder of the leash he wore with pride. The administrator's voice was like the room itself, calm, precise, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was a voice that built empires on the bones of instinct. "The asset is to be relocated," she stated, her image a placid, unreadable mask on the far side of the table. "Project Chimera is entering its final phase. Your mandate is absolute security. The transport is designated Priority Prime." Kalen's gloved hands were clasped behind his back, the synthetic leather creaking faintly. He did not ask what Project Chimera was. He did not ask about the nature of the asset. To ask was to show a fissure in the foundation of his conditioning. His function was to obey, not to comprehend. He was an instrument, sharpened and aimed by a will greater than his own. "There has been chatter," the administrator continued, a flicker of something almost like concern crossing her features before it was smoothed away into placid control. "Factions in the Undercity, sentimentalists, they believe these assets possess a consciousness worthy of preservation." A faint, dry smile touched her lips. "They mistake complex biological response for a soul, a dangerous romantic notion." Kalen's jaw remained tight. He understood. The mission required not just efficiency, but a disavowal of empathy. It was a familiar parameter. The asset is a Class 9 Omega, genetically synthesized. Its pheromonal output is unique. The administrator's gaze seemed to pierce through the hologram and fix upon him. "Your neutralizer module has been calibrated to its specific signature. Under no circumstances is it to be deactivated. The asset's scent is a biological weapon, Captain. Uncontrolled, it incites primal territorialism in alphas. Chaos. It is the very thing our order was created to contain." She gestured, and a new file opened in the air before Kalen. Asset 734, a string of genetic markers, metabolic rates, and neurological response data scrolled past. There was no name, no face, just a column of clinical facts that defined a life. He committed the critical data to memory, a tool assessing the specifications of another tool. "You will be accompanied by Sergeant Jorik and Corporal Vaughn. Your route is secure. Any deviation, any threat is to be neutralized with extreme prejudice. The asset's physical integrity is paramount, but its life is secondary to the security of the project." The words were cold, clear stones dropping into the silent pool of the room. Kalen inclined his head. "Understood, Administrator." The hologram dissolved, plunging the room into the dim, ambient light of the Citadel. The silence that followed was heavy, profound. He stood for a long moment, letting the mission parameters settle into his bones, becoming part of the architecture of his being. He was not a man. He was a function. He was a wall against chaos. The walk to sub-level gamma was a descent into ever deeper layers of silence and sterility. The air grew colder, the light a flat, shadowless white that bleached all color from the world. His boots made no sound on the polished plasteel floors. He could feel the low thrum of the Citadel's life support systems through the soles of his feet, a constant, mechanical heartbeat. Sergeant Jorik and Corporal Vaughn fell into step behind him, their presence a familiar weight of shared discipline. They did not speak. Their thoughts were their own, but their purpose was singular, unified. They were a unit, a three-part weapon. At the final checkpoint, a medic in a sterile white coat administered his calibrated neutralizer. A sharp hiss, a cold prick at the side of his neck. The world, already scentless, became even flatter, a sensory vacuum. He felt the familiar, subtle deadening inside, the tamping down of the primal core that every alpha carried. It was a necessary amputation, a sacrifice for the sake of order. The final door slid open with a whisper of pressurized air. The room beyond was a perfect cube of white. White walls, white floor, white ceiling. The light was diffuse, emanating from the very surfaces themselves, erasing every shadow. It was a space designed to unmake a person, to strip them of all external reference, until they were nothing but a specimen under a microscope. And in the center of the whiteness sat a figure, also in white, Asset 734. It was smaller than the data had suggested. The white, loose-fitting tunic and trousers it wore made it seem fragile, an origami creation that a sharp breath could tear. Its hair was the color of snow, cut short and severe. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, as if it had never been touched by a sun. It sat on a simple white block, its back to the door, perfectly still. Kalen's training took over. He performed a slow 360-degree scan of the room. No anomalies, no threats. The asset was the only variable in this sterile equation. He moved forward, his steps measured, deliberate. Jorik and Vaughn took up positions flanking the door, their rifles held at a low ready. Asset 734, Kalen's voice was a harsh metallic sound in the profound silence. You will stand. You are being relocated. The figure did not move for a long moment. Then, with a slow, liquid grace, it rose. It turned. And Kalen felt the first imperceptible crack in the foundation of his conditioning. The asset had a face. It was a face of sharp, delicate angles, with a mouth that seemed sculpted for sorrow, and eyes the color of a winter sky, a pale, crystalline gray. They were eyes that did not look at him, but through him, as if he were a pane of flawed glass. There was no fear in them, no defiance. There was only a vast, empty stillness, a reflection of the room that had been its entire world. For a fraction of a second, his breath caught in his throat. A biological response, an anomaly. He crushed it instantly, burying it beneath layers of doctrine and discipline. This was not a person. It was a collection of genetic data, a mission objective. He held out a pair of magnetic restraints. Present your hands. The asset looked down at the restraints, then back up at his face. Its gaze was unnervingly direct. It did not comply. It simply watched him, its head tilted slightly, an attitude of quiet, unnerving curiosity. Comply, Kalen repeated, his voice dropping half an octave, the ingrained command of an alpha. The air thickened, a silent contest of wills in a silent, white world. The asset held his gaze for another beat, then slowly, deliberately, extended its pale, slender hands. As Kalen snapped the restraints around its wrists, his gloved fingers brushed against its skin. It was cold, not the cold of the room, but a deeper, more intrinsic cold, as if it held no warmth of its own. He felt a phantom jolt, a static charge that had no business existing in this deadened, neutral space. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a weapon. The mission was everything. He turned, his back rigid. Move. Asset 734 followed him without a sound, a white ghost in a grey soldier's wake, leaving the empty, silent room that was the only home it had ever known. The transition was a violence of sensation. For 17 cycles, his world had been a constant, a known quantity. The seamless white of the walls, the hum of the recycler that was a form of silence, the precise temperature of the air on his skin, the tastelessness of the nutrient paste. These were the parameters of his existence. He was Asset 734, a being defined by the absence of stimuli. Now the world was screaming. The corridor beyond his cube was not white, it was grey, a dead, flat color that felt like dust in his eyes. The light was different. It came from panels above, creating things he had only read about in a datapad. Shadows, long, distorted shapes that clung to the heels of the soldiers, dark echoes of their solid forms. The air tasted wrong. It was still sterile, but it carried faint, alien traces. The ozone tang of active machinery, the bitter scent of the soldiers' uniform sealant, the ghost of something metallic and sharp. He had been taught that the outside was chaos. He had been taught that his purpose was to remain pure, a stable biological source, untainted by the random variables of an uncontrolled environment. The two soldiers in grey were massive, their whole presence a crushing weight. They moved with a predatory economy, their forms radiating a contained power that vibrated against his senses. But it was the one in the lead, the captain, who was a vortex, a black hole in the sensory landscape. The man's control was absolute, a void where instinct should have been. It was more terrifying than any overt threat. He could feel the alpha in him, a caged, starving beast, but it was so deeply buried beneath layers of ice that it was barely a whisper. This alpha was a construct of will, a being who had remade himself into a machine. He called him Asset 734. The name was a tool, like the magnetic restraints that bit into the delicate skin of his wrists. It was meant to reinforce what he was, a thing, an object to be moved and secured. He did not fight it. To fight was to have a self to defend. He was not a self. He was a collection of responses, catalogued and studied. He walked behind the captain, his bare feet padding silently on the cold floor. He kept his eyes on the man's back, a broad, unyielding wall of grey. He measured the rhythm of his walk, the steady, deliberate cadence of a man who had never known hesitation. The transport vehicle was a sealed metal box, darker and more confined than his room. The door hissed shut behind them, and the world became the low thrum of an engine and the smell of ionized air. He was placed on a hard bench, his restraints secured to a D-ring on the wall. The two other soldiers sat opposite, their rifles resting across their laps, their faces impassive. The captain remained standing, one hand braced against the ceiling, his body a rigid pillar against the vehicle's slight motion. He did not look at him. He was scenery, a piece of cargo. The vehicle moved. For the first time in his life, he felt momentum, a lurching, swaying sensation that churned the nutrient paste in his stomach. He closed his eyes, trying to retreat to the familiar white stillness of his mind, but the new sensations kept intruding. The vibration of the floor plates, the subtle shifts in pressure as they accelerated or turned. He focused on the captain. The man was a fixed point in the rolling chaos. He had not moved a millimeter, his body absorbing the vehicle's motion with practiced ease. He wondered what it would be like to possess such certainty, to be so grounded in a purpose that the world could shake around you and you would not fall. He had a purpose he knew, The scientists had told him he was a key. His biology, the unique pheromonal signature they so carefully monitored, was essential. He was to be a cornerstone of a new era of order. He did not understand what that meant, but he understood that his value was in his physical form. He was a vessel, precious but empty. A sudden violent jolt threw him against his restraints. The lights flickered and died, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. A high-pitched shriek of tortured metal tore through the air, followed by a deafening impact that seemed to compress the world into a single, agonizing moment. He was thrown sideways, his head striking the wall with a sickening crack. Colors exploded behind his eyes, red and white. The world tilted, spun, and then there was only noise and the sensation of falling. He could hear shouting, the percussive, terrifying crack of weapons fire from outside. The vehicle groaned, settling at a grotesque angle. In the blackness, he could smell something new, something hot and sharp. Smoke, the scent of burning. One of the soldiers opposite him made a choked, wet sound. The other was screaming, a string of harsh, meaningless syllables. Then, a new light bloomed in the darkness, a searing, brilliant white light that sliced through the side of the transport, accompanied by a sound that was less a sound and more a physical blow. The screaming stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. He lay on the floor, tangled in the bench harness, his head throbbing in a sharp, pulsing rhythm. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of scorched metal and something else. Something coppery and organic. He knew the smell from his own blood tests. The door was wrenched open with a scream of metal. Silhouettes appeared, dark against a chaotic backdrop of fire and rain. He had only read about rain. He had never imagined it would smell like this, of wet earth and ozone and something green and alive. Figures moved in the opening. They were not soldiers. They were ragged, their movements frantic, uncoordinated. Chaos. "Get the package! Go, go, go!" a voice yelled. Before they could enter, a shape moved in the darkness of the cabin, a blur of grey. The captain. He moved with an impossible, lethal speed. There was a series of swift, brutal sounds, a wet thud, a choked gasp, a heavy fall. The silhouettes in the doorway crumpled. The captain stood over them, a shadow against the flickering orange light. He held a combat knife in one hand, its blade dark with fluid. He turned, and even in the dimness, Elian could see the cold fire in his eyes. The machine was gone. The beast was awake. The captain moved to him, cutting his restraints with a single, efficient slice. He grabbed Elian's arm, his grip a band of steel, and hauled him to his feet. "Move," he snarled, the word a raw, guttural command. He pushed Elian toward the ruined doorway, out of the metal box, out of the only world he had ever known, and into the screaming, burning, living chaos of the outside. The cold rain hit his face like 1,000 tiny needles, and for the first time he breathed air that was not manufactured. It was thick with the scent of fire and blood and wet, decaying life, and it was the most terrifying and wonderful thing he had ever experienced. Kalen's world had compressed to a razor's edge of tactical awareness. The ambush had been precise, professional. An anti-material plasma charge had disabled the transport, and the ensuing firefight had eliminated his team in under 10 seconds. Vaughn was dead before he hit the floor. Jorik had bled out from a shard of shrapnel. They were acceptable losses. The mission was not. He had dispatched the 2 scavengers at the door with brutal, conditioned efficiency. A knife thrust to the throat, a reverse grip to the sternum. No hesitation, no thought, just the pure, cold calculus of survival. Now, he was outside, in the rain-slicked guts of an undercity alleyway. The transport burned behind them, casting a strobing, hellish orange light on the grimy brick walls. The asset 734, was stumbling beside him, a pale, trembling shape in the darkness. Kalen's grip on its arm was unforgiving. It was a lifeline. It was a leash. His comms were dead. His support team was gone. His primary transport was a pyre. Protocol was clear. Secure the asset, evade contact, proceed to the nearest secondary extraction point. He scanned the alley. 2 directions. Left led deeper into the labyrinthine warren of the Undercity. Right led toward the service conduits that ascended back to the Citadel's lower levels. The logical choice was right. The disciplined choice. He started to pull the asset in that direction when a piece of shrapnel embedded in his thigh, a souvenir from the initial blast, sent a spike of white-hot agony up his leg. He faltered for a half step, a grunt of pain escaping his lips. At the same moment, the asset slipped on the wet ground, its bare feet finding no purchase. It fell, pulling him off balance. As he went down, his helmeted head slammed against the transport's chassis. The world fractured into a kaleidoscope of static and error messages. His HUD flickered and died. The impact had cracked the helmet's shell near the base, and with a hiss of depressurization, the delicate systems that controlled his sensory input failed. The first thing he noticed was the sound. The muffled, filtered world he inhabited was gone. Now he could hear everything. The hiss of the rain on hot metal, the distant echoing sirens, the frantic skittering of some unseen vermin in the shadows, the ragged, panicked sound of the asset's breathing. And then came the scent. His neutralizer module had been compromised. The dead, flat vacuum in his senses was gone, and the world rushed in like a tidal wave. It was a foul, organic soup of smells, wet decay, rust, overflowing refuse, the acrid stench of the chemical fires from the burning transport. It was nauseating, a symphony of chaos, but beneath it all, cutting through the filth like a beam of pure light, was another scent. It was coming from the asset, now huddled on the ground beside him. The administrator's words echoed in his mind. A biological weapon. It incites primal territorialism. Chaos. This was not chaos. This was order. A different kind of order. It was the scent of ozone after a lightning strike, clean and sharp. It was the scent of crushed mint leaves and cool, clear water. And under that, something else. Something achingly familiar and yet utterly alien. The scent of profound, heartbreaking loneliness. It did not incite rage. It did not trigger a desire for dominance. It bypassed the higher functions of his brain, the decades of conditioning and discipline, and struck a chord deep within the most primal part of his being, a part he did not know existed. It was a scent that whispered of solace, of sanctuary, of home. His alpha, the caged and brutalized thing he kept locked in the deepest dungeon of his mind, stirred. It did not roar. It uncurled, slowly, like a great beast waking from a long slumber, and it recognized that scent. It recognized it as mate. The thought was a violation, a heresy. He scrambled to his feet, putting distance between himself and the source of the scent, his wounded leg screaming in protest. He ripped the damaged helmet from his head and threw it to the ground, as if that could sever the connection. He could see the asset clearly now, its pale face streaked with grime, its wide, terrified eyes fixed on him. Its scent was pouring off it in waves, intensified by its fear. Kalen's heart hammered against his ribs, a wild, frantic drumbeat. His breath came in ragged gasps. He was losing control. The discipline that had been the bedrock of his existence was fracturing, crumbling into dust. He was a captain of the Enforcer Corps. He was a bulwark against this very chaos. He was not an animal, slave to his instincts. He forced himself to breathe. In for 4 counts, hold for 7, out for 8. The calming technique drilled into him since he was a boy. It was a thin shield against a hurricane. "Get up," he snarled, the words rough, torn from his throat. He did not offer a hand. He could not trust himself to touch it again. The asset flinched at the sound of his voice, but obeyed, rising with a fluid, unsteady grace. Its white tunic was soaked through and plastered to its thin frame. It was shivering, from cold or from fear. He couldn't tell. He had to make a choice. The service conduits were no longer an option. He was compromised. His instincts were screaming at him, a cacophony of new, terrifying impulses. To get closer, to shield the asset with his own body, to eliminate every perceived threat in a 100-meter radius, to find a safe place, a den, and keep it there, safe from the world, safe for him. This was the chaos the administrator had warned of. It was inside him. He looked left, into the maw of the Undercity. It was illogical, dangerous, unpredictable. But it was away from the citadel, away from the structure and the rules he was no longer certain he could obey. It was a place to get lost, a place to hide, not just the asset, but himself. From himself. He grabbed its arm again, his touch rougher than necessary, an act of defiance against the instinct that urged tenderness. The contact sent another jolt through him, a current of warmth against the cold rain. The asset's skin was like ice, its scent now, tinged with a new note of confusion and pain wrapped around him, a silken, invisible chain. "This way," he commanded, his voice a low growl. He half-dragged, half-led it away from the fire, away from the wreckage of his former certainty, and plunged into the dripping, shadowed heart of the darkness. Every step was an agony, both from the wound in his leg and the war raging within his own soul. He was not protecting an asset. He was not completing a mission. He was running, and for the first time in his life, he did not know what from, or what to. He was a weapon that had forgotten its purpose, guided only by a scent that promised either salvation or damnation, and he could no longer tell the difference. The world was a blur of sharp edges and overwhelming sensations. His bare feet, which had only ever known the smooth, sterile floor of his room, were now being sliced by unseen debris, bruised by the uneven ground. The pain was a distant, secondary input, drowned out by the flood of new data. The feeling of rain, a constant cold trickle against his skin and hair, was the most persistent. It was not like the controlled sonic showers in his room. This was wild, unpredictable. It plastered his thin tunic to his body, leeching away what little warmth he possessed. He was cold. He understood the concept of cold, the number on a display, but he had never felt it before. It was a deep, invasive ache that made his teeth chatter and his muscles tremble. The sounds were a cacophony, the hiss and crackle of the fire behind them, the drip of water from rusted pipes overhead, the distant, mournful cry of a siren, and the harsh, ragged sound of the captain's breathing. He was a creature of silence, and this noise was a physical assault, scraping against his nerves. But the scents were the most powerful, the most disorienting. The Undercity smelled of decay, and life inextricably mixed. The sweet, cloying odor of rot, the metallic tang of rust, the sharp, pungent smell of unidentifiable chemicals, and under it all, the rich, dark scent of damp earth. It was a world of textures, a world of smells, and it was too much. He stumbled, his senses reeling. The only constant, the only anchor in this swirling chaos was the iron grip of the captain on his arm. The soldier was a point of stability, a solid, warm presence in the cold, shifting darkness. But he was also the source of a new, terrifying confusion. When the soldier's helmet had been breached, something had broken in him. The icy control, the void where his presence should be, had shattered. Now, a storm raged within him. Elian could feel it. He had always been sensitive to the subtle shifts in the state of others, a skill honed by a life of silent observation. But this was different. It was not an observation. It was a resonance. He could feel the Alpha's turmoil as if it were his own. The confusion, the pain, the raw, violent instinct that warred with a lifetime of rigid control. It pulsed from the captain in waves, a silent scream that was louder than any of the noises of the alley, and it was directed at him. The captain's own scent, previously locked away, was now bleeding into the air. It was sharp and clean, like cold mountain air and pine, but underscored with the metallic tang of fresh blood from his wound and the acrid scent of pure, undiluted aggression. It was a terrifying scent, the scent of a predator, but woven through it was that thread of confusion, a scent like ozone and scorched wiring, the smell of a machine breaking down. He was the cause. He knew it, instinctively. His own scent, the part of him the scientists had cultivated and prized, the part they kept him isolated for, was affecting the Alpha. He had seen the data. He knew what it was supposed to do: disrupt, confuse, incite. He had been designed as a key, but also as a weapon. And now that weapon was aimed at the one person keeping him alive. He was a danger to his own protector. He risked another glance at the captain's face, illuminated briefly by a flickering neon sign from a cross alley. The man's jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his cheek stood out like cords. His eyes, a dark, piercing blue, were fixed forward, but they were unfocused, looking inward at the battle being waged there. A line of sweat or rain trickled down his temple, tracing a path through the grime on his face. The hand on his arm was trembling, a minute vibration of immense, suppressed force. Elian felt a strange, alien emotion flicker within him. It was not fear. He was familiar with fear, the cold clenching in his gut. This was something else, a phantom echo of the Alpha's pain, a nascent, budding thing that felt dangerously like empathy. He was an asset. Assets did not feel empathy. They were objects. He tried to retreat into that familiar state, to become a thing again, to shut down the overwhelming flood of sensory input. He focused on the physical sensations, the cold, the pain in his feet, the crushing grip on his arm. But it was no use. The world had broken in, and it could not be unknown. The captain suddenly pulled him into a deeper shadow, pressing them both flat against a crumbling brick wall. The soldier's body was a shield, caging him in. Elian was pressed against the man's chest, the hard plates of his body armor digging into his cheek. He could feel the frantic, heavy beat of the Alpha's heart against his own ribs. He could smell the sense of him, unfiltered, overwhelming. The pine and cold air, the blood, and beneath it all, a dark, rich musk that was purely Alpha. It should have been terrifying. It was, but it was also grounding, a solid, living thing in a world of ghosts and shadows. The captain's head was turned, his gaze sweeping the alley they had just left. A patrol. 2 more enforcers, their helmet lights cutting sharp, white cones through the darkness. They moved with the same lethal precision as the captain. They were hunters, and they were hunting him. The captain did not move. He did not breathe. He became part of the shadow, a creature of the darkness. Elian mirrored him, forcing his own shivering body into stillness, holding his breath until his lungs burned. He could feel the tension in the captain's muscles, coiled and ready to strike. He was a weapon, aimed and waiting. The patrol passed. Their lights swept over their hiding place and moved on. The sound of their footsteps faded into the endless drip of the rain. Only then did the captain release his breath, a slow, controlled hiss. The tension in his body eased, but only slightly. He did not move away. For a long moment, they remained pressed together in the darkness. Elian could feel the heat radiating from the Alpha's body, a stark contrast to his own icy skin. The instinct to lean into that warmth was a powerful, primal urge. He resisted it. He was a weapon. He was a mission. He was not a creature seeking warmth. But as the captain finally pulled away, the loss of that solid, living heat left him feeling colder and more alone than he had ever been in his sterile white room. The Alpha's gaze met his in the gloom, and for a second the mask of the soldier slipped. Elian saw not a captain, not an enforcer, but a man lost in a storm, his eyes reflecting a terrifying, desperate vulnerability. Then it was gone, shuttered away behind a wall of ice. The machine was rebuilding itself, piece by painful piece. They found shelter in the rusted-out shell of an ancient manufactory, a skeletal ruin from a forgotten age of industry. The roof was a lattice of corroded steel beams against the bruised purple sky, offering little protection from the persistent, drizzling rain. But it was secluded, a pocket of decay hidden from the main thoroughfares of the Undercity. Kalen pushed the asset into the relative cover of a collapsed wall and immediately set to work, securing the perimeter. His leg was a constant, throbbing agony, and each step sent shards of glass grinding through his nervous system. He ignored it. Pain was a data point, nothing more. It informed his assessment of his own combat effectiveness, which was currently degraded by approximately 27%. Acceptable, for now. He moved through the ruins with a predator's silence, his senses on a knife's edge. The chaotic symphony of the Undercity was a tactical map of sound and scent. He could distinguish the drip of water from the scuttling of vermin, the distant hum of a patrol skimmer from the groan of stressed metal, and ever-present, the scent of the asset. It clung to the damp air, a beacon. It was a liability, a catastrophic compromise of operational security. Yet, the thought of leaving it, of creating distance, was a physical impossibility. His conditioning and his instincts were locked in a death struggle, and the mission was the casualty. He returned to find the asset huddled where he had left it, shivering violently, its thin white tunic offering no insulation. Its pale hair was plastered to its skull, and its face, smudged with dirt, was stark and ethereal in the gloom. Its grey eyes followed his every movement. They were not the eyes of an animal. They were not the eyes of a thing. They were ancient, filled with a quiet, unnerving intelligence. An intelligence that seemed to see straight through the armor, through the training, to the broken, malfunctioning machine within. A piece of jagged metal had sliced through the asset's tunic at the knee, and a shallow but steady line of blood trickled down its shin. The coppery scent of it mingled with its own unique pheromones, creating a compound that was dizzying, almost intoxicating. It was a trigger. His training screamed at him. Injured asset, compromised viability, assess and report. His instinct roared something else entirely. Wounded mate, threat, protect, tend. The instinct won. The victory was terrifying. He knelt, his own wounded leg protesting fiercely. He unsealed a small medkit from his belt, his movements stiff and clumsy. His gloved hands, which could field strip a plasma rifle in 20 seconds flat, felt like foreign, unwieldy objects. "Hold still," he ordered, his voice rougher than he intended. The asset flinched, but did not pull away. It simply watched him, its gaze unwavering as he took a sterile cleansing wipe to the wound. As he touched its skin, a tremor went through its body, and through his. The contact was electric. Through the thin material of his glove, he could feel the coldness of its skin, the fine, almost imperceptible trembling. Its scent spiked, a sharp, clean note of fear and pain that lanced directly into the base of his skull. His own body responded instantly. His breath hitched. A low growl rumbled in his chest, an involuntary, primal sound of soothing that he choked back with a force of will that made his teeth ache. He worked with brutal, clipped efficiency, cleaning the wound, applying a thin layer of biogel, and sealing it with a dermal patch. His every movement was a denial of the urge to be gentle. He was a soldier. He was performing field medicine on a piece of mission-critical equipment. That was all. As he finished, a memory, unbidden and unwelcome, surfaced from the deep archives of his mind. He was a boy, no older than 10, in the Alpha training creche. He had fallen during a combat drill, a deep gash in his arm. The training master, a hard-faced man with eyes like chips of granite, had watched him bleed. "Pain is a lesson," the master had said, his voice flat. "Dependency is a weakness. An Alpha tends to his own wounds. He does not seek comfort. He does not offer it." Kalen had patched his own arm that day, his small hands shaking, tears of pain and humiliation blurring his vision. He had learned the lesson well. He had cauterized the part of himself that felt, that needed. He looked at the asset, at the stark white of the dermal patch against its pale skin. He saw the same sterile efficiency he had been taught, the same denial of comfort. He saw his own past reflected in its wide, terrified eyes, and he felt the first true, undeniable surge of rage he had felt in years. Not at the asset, not at the ambushes, but at the system that had forged them both, the system that took children and reshaped them into tools and weapons. The asset spoke, its voice a soft, low whisper, barely audible above the rain. Why? It was the first time it had initiated communication, the first time it had asked a question. The sound of its voice was like its scent, clean, clear, and achingly lonely. Kalen stood up abruptly, turning his back on it. He could not look at it. He could not let it see the cracks in his armor. He stared out into the rain-swept darkness, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He needed the wall of his discipline. He needed the cold, hard logic of the mission. It was the only thing holding him together. "You are the mission," he said, his voice a dead, flat monotone. He spoke the words to the darkness, to the rain, but they were meant for himself. A mantra, a prayer to the god of order he no longer believed in. "Securing you is my only directive. Nothing more. The words hung in the air between them, cold and sharp and heavy as stone. He had meant them to be a shield, a reinforcement of the distance between them. But as the silence stretched, he heard a small, hitched breath from behind him, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he had not built a wall. He had used his words as a weapon, and he had struck the only other living soul in this desolate ruin, the very soul he was unaccountably desperate to protect. The rain continued to fall, a sound like quiet, indifferent weeping. The words settled over him like a shroud. You are the mission. Nothing more. He had always known this, in a theoretical sense. It was the foundation of his existence, the first and last truth of his world. He was Asset 734, a biological objective, a thing to be studied, contained, and relocated. But hearing it spoken aloud by the one being who had pulled him from the fire, the one being whose frantic heartbeat he had felt against his own chest, gave the truth a new and terrible weight. It was not a definition. It was a sentence. He lowered his gaze to the new, sterile white patch on his knee. The captain's touch had been brutally efficient, devoid of any gentleness, yet it had been a touch nonetheless, a moment of focused attention that was a universe away from the detached prodding of the scientist's instruments. He had allowed himself, for a fraction of a second, to believe that touch might have been for him, not for the asset. The captain's words had corrected that error. He was a fool, a complex biological response mistaken for a soul. He drew his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around them, trying to conserve some fragment of warmth. The cold was deep in his bones now. The shivering had subsided into a dull, constant tremor. He watched the captain's back. It was a fortress of grey fabric and rigid posture. The man stood staring out into the rain, a sentinel guarding a package. A very valuable, very troublesome package. A profound sense of desolation washed over Elian, colder and more invasive than the rain. In his white room, he had been lonely, but it was a sterile, theoretical loneliness. He had not known what he was missing. Now he had felt the warmth of another's body, heard the sound of a voice that was not a recording, felt the confusing, terrifying pull of another's inner chaos. He had been given a glimpse of connection, only to have it defined as a parameter of a mission. The emptiness that followed was a vast, cavernous thing. He had to be more than this. He had to be useful. A useful asset is a valuable asset. A valuable asset is protected. His survival depended on his utility. He pushed aside the cold bloom of despair and forced his mind to work. He began to do what he had always done in his room: observe, analyze, process data. He expanded his senses, not inward toward the storm of his own feelings, but outward, into the environment. He let the cacophony of the undercity resolve into distinct threads of information. The rhythmic drip from a rusted beam was a natural metronome. The skittering sounds were organic, non-threatening. The distant hums were mechanical, their pitch and direction indicating their trajectory. He was a creature of pattern recognition. His entire life had been a study in the minute variations of a controlled environment. The chaos of this place was just a more complex system, a data set of a higher order. A new sound reached him, faint and intermittent, almost lost beneath the sound of the rain. It was a soft, rhythmic crunching, not random like the settling of debris. It was patterned. Footsteps, more than 2 sets. They were trying to be quiet, using the ambient noise to cover their approach, but their discipline was imperfect. One of them had a slight drag to his left foot. Another carried his weight unevenly. He focused, filtering out everything else. They were coming from the southeast, using the skeletal remains of a parallel structure for cover. He counted 4 of them. He looked at the captain. The alpha was still rigid, his attention seemingly fixed on the alley ahead. He was a predator, but he was a wounded one, distracted by the war within himself. He had not heard them. Elian felt a surge of something sharp and urgent. Adrenaline, his own biological response. He had to warn him. But how? To speak would be to make a sound, to reveal their position. He looked around their small sanctuary. To his right was a pile of loose rubble, small stones and shards of rusted metal. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers closing around a small, sharp-edged piece of plasteel. It was a risk, a deviation from his designated function. But what was his function now? To be a passive package, waiting for capture or termination. The captain's words echoed in his mind. You are the mission. His survival was the mission. He took a steadying breath, the cold air burning his lungs. He aimed for a large, flat sheet of metal, leaning against the far wall of the ruin, 20 meters away. He threw the shard. He was not strong, but his movements, honed by a life of stillness, were precise. The shard flew true, striking the metal sheet with a sharp clank that echoed through the manufactory. The sound was abrupt, unnatural, a stark anomaly in the rhythm of the rain. Instantly, the captain spun around, dropping into a low crouch, his sidearm in his hand before the echo had faded. His eyes, sharp and lethal, scanned the darkness, pinpointing the source of the noise. Then, his gaze snapped to Elian. He saw the question in them, the suspicion. Elian did not look away. He held the alpha's gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod toward the southeast, the direction of the approaching footsteps. Understanding dawned on the captain's face, quickly replaced by a cold, tactical assessment. He did not praise him. He did not acknowledge the warning with anything more than a fractional narrowing of his eyes. He simply processed the new data and acted. He moved to Elian's side, his presence a sudden, oppressive weight of focused intent. He put a finger to his lips in the universal sign for silence, then pointed to a deeper recess in the collapsed wall, a place of near total darkness. He was giving an order. Elian obeyed without hesitation, scrambling into the shadows. The captain melted back into the ruins, becoming one with the darkness, his sidearm tracking, his body a coiled spring of lethal potential. Elian huddled in the recess, his heart hammering. He had done something. He had acted. He had contributed. He was no longer just a package to be carried. He was part of the mission. And as he listened to the tense, waiting silence, a new, fierce, and terrifying thought took root in his mind. He wanted this mission to succeed, not for the sake of the project, not for the sake of the citadel, but for the sake of the broken, dangerous man who was, at this moment, the only thing standing between him and the darkness. The asset's warning had been a tactical gift. Kalen had been compromised, his focus turned inward, his senses dulled by the war in his own blood. The creature he was tasked to protect, the source of his internal chaos, had just saved his life. The irony was a bitter pill. He melted into the shadows, the familiar hunt and evade protocols overriding the turmoil in his mind. This was his element, the darkness, the threat, the cold calculus of violence. It was a perverted form of comfort. He watched the four-man fire team enter the manufactory. They were syndicate, not enforcer corps. Their movements were too loose, their equipment a mix of standard issue and black market modifications. Internal security, likely a corporate faction. They were not here for a simple retrieval. Their weapons were raised, safeties off. This was a termination squad. They swept the area in a standard diamond formation, their helmet lamps cutting through the gloom. They were competent, but not elite. Their mistake was relying on technology in a place where the senses were king. They trusted their thermal images, which were being fooled by the pockets of residual heat from the decaying machinery and the ambient cold of the rain. They did not trust their noses. Kalen could smell them. The faint, astringent scent of their weapon-cleaning solvent, the recycled air from their rebreathers, the faint tang of their own nervous sweat. And they, in turn, could not smell him. The wind and rain were his allies, scattering his scent, masking his presence. More importantly, they could not smell the prize they were hunting. Elian's scent, so overwhelming to Kalen, was a ghost on the air, a subtle anomaly they were not trained to detect. He let them pass his position. He was a patient hunter. The one in the rear, the one with the dragging foot Elian had somehow detected, was the weak link. Kalen moved like a phantom, his steps silent on the debris-strewn floor. He came up behind the man, one hand clamping over his mouth and rebreather, stifling any sound, the other driving the 9-inch blade of his combat knife up under the man's sternum, piercing the heart. He lowered the body to the ground without a sound. One down. The team leader, a bulky man with a captain's insignia crudely painted on his helmet, signaled a halt. He had noticed. He was a professional. Status 4, he subvocalized, his voice a tinny rasp over their short-range comms. Kalen could hear it, a faint whisper in the quiet. Silence. 4, report, the leader commanded, a new edge to his voice. He motioned for the other two to form a perimeter, their rifles sweeping the darkness. They were on high alert now. Kalen had lost the element of surprise. He changed tactics. From the shadows, he watched them. They were clustered near the center of the ruin, back to back. A defensive position. Foolish. It made them a single, collective target. He unclipped a concussion grenade from his belt. Not lethal, but disorienting. He pulled the pin and rolled it gently across the floor. It came to a stop a few meters from their position. The 3-second fuse was an eternity. The grenade detonated with a deafening crack and a flash of brilliant white light. Even with his eyes squeezed shut, the intensity burned through his eyelids. The 3 soldiers were thrown to the ground, their helmet systems likely fried, their senses scrambled. Kalen was on them before the flash had faded. He moved with a brutal economy of motion that was pure, conditioned reflex. A single shot to the helmet of the first man, a knife thrust to the throat of the second. He was a machine processing threats. That left the leader. The man was tougher, already shaking off the effects of the blast, rolling to his knees and bringing his rifle up. Kalen kicked it from his hands. The rifle clattered away into the darkness. The leader lunged, a vibroblade hissing to life in his hand. Kalen met him head-on. The fight was short, nasty, and brutish. The man was strong, but Kalen was faster, fueled by a cold, precise rage. He deflected the vibroblade with his armored forearm, the weapon screaming against the composite plating. He slammed the butt of his pistol into the man's helmet, cracking the faceplate. He drove his knee into the man's gut, then brought his elbow down on the back of his neck with enough force to sever the spinal cord. The man crumpled. Silence returned to the ruin, broken only by the rain. Kalen stood over the bodies, his chest heaving. The metallic scent of blood was thick in the air. The machine had performed its function flawlessly. But as the adrenaline began to recede, the chaos rushed back in. He looked at his hands, the blood on his gloves, the bodies at his feet. This was his life's work, the clean, efficient application of violence in the service of order. But whose order? He searched the leader's body, pulling a datapad from his tactical vest. The screen was cracked but functional. He accessed the mission briefing. It was encrypted, but his captain-level clearance codes sliced through it. The words on the screen made the blood freeze in his veins. Mission Directive. Asset 734. Objective: neutralize and retrieve. Asset is compromised. Scheduled decommissioning at Facility Omega is to be expedited. Note: Enforcer Escort Captain Valerius is considered expendable. If he resists, terminate. Decommissioning. It was a sterile corporate word, a euphemism. He knew what it meant. Vivisection, a full biological extraction. They would peel the asset apart, layer by layer, to harvest every secret of its unique genetics. The process was always, without exception, terminal. The transport was not a relocation. It was a death sentence. The mission he had been given was a lie. He was not a guardian. He was an executioner's escort. He was delivering a lamb to the slaughter, and his own life was forfeit, a loose end to be tied up. The administrator's placid face flashed in his mind. The asset's physical integrity is paramount, but its life is secondary to the security of the project. He had been a fool, a blind, obedient fool. He looked over to the dark recess where Elian was hiding. The asset, the mission, the boy with the winter sky eyes who had warned him of the attack, who had looked at him with something other than fear, who smelled of solitude and rain. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a person, and Kalen had been ordered to deliver him to his death. The foundation of his world did not crack. It disintegrated. It turned to dust and blew away in the cold, wet wind. All that was left was a single burning point of clarity, a new directive forged not in the cold logic of the citadel, but in the fire of his own shattered soul. He would not obey. He walked back to the recess. Elian peered out at him from the darkness, his pale face a question mark. His grey eyes were fixed on the datapad in Kalen's hand. He knew. Kalen did not know how, but the boy knew. He saw the truth reflected in the Alpha's eyes. Kalen dropped the datapad to the ground, the screen shattering. He looked at Elian, and for the first time he let the mask of the soldier fall away completely. He let the boys see the rage, the regret, and the terrible nascent resolve in his eyes. He had no plan. He had no support. He was a traitor to the only home he had ever known. He had nothing left but a single, impossible purpose. "They want to kill you," Kalen said, his voice raw, stripped of all artifice. "They were never relocating you." He saw the understanding in Elian's eyes. There was no shock, no surprise, only a quiet, sad affirmation, as if he were hearing a truth he had always known in his bones. And then, something else. A flicker of defiance, a spark in the grey depths. Kalen held out his hand, not in command, not to restrain. It was an offering, a question, an invitation to a future that would almost certainly kill them both. "I will not let them," he said. And it was not a promise to an asset. It was a vow The universe constricted to the space between them. The ruin, the rain, the dead men at their feet, it all faded into a grey, indistinct periphery. All that existed was the Alpha's outstretched hand and the terrible, beautiful vow that hung in the air. I will not let them. Elian looked at the hand. It was large, encased in black, functional leather, stained with the grime of their flight and the blood of their enemies. It was a hand that had restrained him, a hand that had tended his wound with brutal efficiency, a hand that had just dealt death with cold precision. It was a killer's hand, and it was being offered to him. He had never been offered a choice before. His life had been a series of directives issued by others. Consume nutrient paste. Enter the scanner. Present your arm. His compliance had been the only currency he possessed. Now, this man, this broken soldier who smelled of pine and rage, was offering him… what? A chance? A different cage? A swifter death? He looked up from the hand to the captain's face. The mask was gone. The machine had been shed. In its place was a man, raw and exposed. His dark blue eyes were a tempest of emotion, but at their center was a core of unshakable resolve. He was a weapon, yes, but he had just chosen a new target, the system that had created them both. He remembered the feeling of the captain's body shielding his own, the solid, living warmth of it. He remembered the low, involuntary growl in his chest as he tended Elian's wound, a sound of pure, primal protection that the Alpha had tried and failed to suppress. He remembered the way he had said, "You are the mission," and the lie had been a shield for his own fracturing soul. He was not just a mission to this man. Not anymore. Elian was a key, a biological treasure. His value was his life. The captain was a soldier, a tool. His value was his death. They were two sides of the same counterfeit coin minted by the syndicate, and together they were worthless to the system, and therefore free of it. He felt the spark of defiance he had seen in the captain's eyes ignite within his own chest. It was a small, fragile flame, but it was warm. It was his. He made his first true choice. Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted his own hand and placed it in the captain's. His pale, slender fingers were dwarfed by the soldier's grip. The contact was a shock. The leather of the glove was cool and damp, but beneath it he could feel the radiating heat of the man's skin. It was real, solid, a promise of shared existence. Kalen's fingers closed around his grip firm, secure. It was not the grip of a guard with a prisoner. It was the grip of an anchor. As if on cue, the world chose that moment to intrude. A low, menacing hum grew in the air, rapidly escalating to a roar. Searchlights sliced through the rain, sweeping across the ruins. A heavy transport skimmer, the kind used by the Enforcer Corps' elite shock troops, descended from the dark sky, its engines blasting water and debris in every direction. They were out of time. "We have to go." "Now," Kalen said, his voice urgent. He was already moving, pulling Elian with him toward the back of the manufactory, away from the approaching lights. They scrambled over piles of rubble, through jagged holes in rusted walls. Kalen moved with a desperate, pain-fueled urgency, his wounded leg a clear liability. He was limping heavily, but he did not slow. His grip on Elian's hand was an unbreakable tether. They emerged from the ruin into another alley, this one narrower, deeper in shadow. The roar of the skimmer was almost directly overhead. Soldiers were deploying, their shouted commands sharp and clear in the night. They were trapped. Kalen shoved Elian behind a large, overflowing refuse container and drew his pistol, his back pressing against the cold metal. He was preparing to make a final stand, a last, futile act of defiance. He was going to die here. For him. For an asset he had met less than a day ago. The small, fragile flame of defiance in Elian's chest blazed into a wild fire. No, he would not be a passive package any longer. He would not be the reason for this man's death. He closed his eyes, shutting out the chaos, the flashing lights, the shouting. He turned his senses inward to the core of his being, to the very thing the scientists had cultivated, his scent, his biological weapon. They had taught him to suppress it, to keep it contained. They had warned him that its uncontrolled release was dangerous. Good. He let go. He opened the floodgates. He did not push. He simply released. He let all the terror, all the rage, all the desperate, aching loneliness of his 17 years of sterile existence pour out of him, not as a thought, not as a sound, but as a scent. It was a silent, psychic scream. The air in the alleyway went thick, super-saturated with his pheromones. It was the scent of ozone and mint and solitude, but amplified 1,000 times, twisted and sharpened by the raw, violent emotion behind it. It was the scent of a cornered, terrified Omega, a scent designed by nature to drive alphas into a frenzy, either to protect or to kill. To Kalen, standing beside him, it was a physical blow. He staggered, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. His eyes widened, the pupils dilating until they were almost entirely black. The scent was a pure, undiluted agony of protective instinct. It screamed mate, danger, kill. It was all he could do to not turn his weapon on the entire world. But for the other alphas, the shock troops hunting them, it was pure chaos. It slammed into their senses, bypassing their neutralizers, which were not calibrated for this level of output. It was a signal that contradicted their orders. Their discipline warred with a primal instinct they had been trained to deny. Elian could hear it in the sudden confusion of their shouts. The crisp commands dissolved into guttural snarls. He heard the sound of a fist hitting armor, a curse, a roar of pure, unadulterated rage. They were turning on each other. Their ingrained pack hierarchy was shattering, their focus lost in a red mist of pheromone-induced territorialism. The hunt had devolved into a brawl. Kalen stared at him, his face a mask of awe and horror. He saw the power Elian had unleashed. He saw the cost. Blood was trickling from Elian's nose, and a violent tremor was shaking his small frame. The effort had taken a severe physical toll. Using the chaos he had created, Kalen grabbed him, half lifting him, and plunged deeper into the labyrinth of the Undercity. They ran, leaving the sounds of the brawl, the screams and the snarls behind them. They were no longer hunter and hunted. They were something new, two broken pieces of a corrupt system running together, hand in hand, into a dark and uncertain future. They were a rebellion of two. And for the first time, huddled in the darkness, Elian felt the ghost of a smile touch his lips. He was not just a mission, he was a weapon, and he had just chosen his own war. The aftermath of the pheromonal burst left Elian drained, a hollowed-out vessel. The world swam in and out of focus, and the sounds of their flight were a distant, muffled roar. He was aware of the hard ground beneath his feet, of the unyielding grip Kalen had on his arm, of the cold rain on his face. But it all felt disconnected, happening to someone else. He had poured his life, his pain, his very essence into that single, silent scream. And now there was almost nothing left. He stumbled, his legs refusing to obey, and would have fallen if Kalen hadn't swept him up into his arms. The movement was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the brutal efficiency he had shown before. Elian was light, a bird-like weight against the alpha's hard, armored chest. He buried his face against Kalen's shoulder, too exhausted to do anything else. He was enveloped in the alpha's scent, pine, cold air, and the sharp tang of his blood. And for the first time, it felt less like a threat and more like a shield, a sanctuary. Kalen moved with a desperate, limping gait, his wounded body protesting every step. But he did not stop. He was a force of pure, unyielding will, carrying his precious, broken cargo through the rain-drenched arteries of the Undercity. He found refuge in a place of impossible, organic beauty, an abandoned arboretum, its great glass-domed roof shattered in a spiderweb of cracks, allowing the rain and the wild to reclaim the space. Inside, massive, unidentifiable trees reached like skeletal fingers toward the bruised sky. Vines choked ancient statues, and a thick carpet of moss and phosphorescent fungi covered everything, casting the vast space in a soft, ethereal green and blue light. It was a cathedral of decay and rebirth, a place where life, untamed and chaotic, had triumphed over the sterile order that had built it. Kalen finally allowed himself to stop. He gently lowered Elian onto a bed of soft moss at the base of a colossal, gnarled tree. The alpha collapsed beside him, his back against the trunk, his breath coming in harsh, ragged pants. The adrenaline that had sustained him was gone, leaving only exhaustion and agony in its wake. His leg was bleeding freely now, the dark stain spreading across his grey uniform trousers. The roles were reversed. The protector was now the one who was wounded, vulnerable. Elian pushed himself up, his movements slow, his limbs heavy as lead. He looked at Kalen. The alpha's face was pale beneath the grime, his features tight with pain. His eyes were closed, his jaw clenched. The machine had finally run out of power. A new feeling, core fierce and sharp, pierced through Elian's exhaustion. It was the echo of the protective instinct he had felt from the alpha, now mirrored in his own heart. He would not let him die. He tore a long strip from the hem of his white tunic. It was flimsy, inadequate, but it was all he had. He crawled over to Kalen's side. The alpha's eyes snapped open at his proximity, a flicker of the cornered predators in their depths. "Stay back," he rasped, the command a ghost of his former authority. Elian ignored him. He met the alpha's gaze, and for the first time there was no fear in his own, only a quiet, unwavering resolve. He reached out and gently took hold of Kalen's wounded leg. The alpha flinched, a hiss of pain escaping his lips, but he did not pull away. He watched, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief, as Elian began to clean the wound. His touch was hesitant, clumsy. He had never tended to another living being in his life. He used the rainwater that had collected in the cup of a large leaf to wash away the blood and grime, his fingers gentle against the torn flesh. He then wrapped the wound tightly with the strip of his tunic, creating a makeshift pressure bandage. It was a poor substitute for a real med kit, but it was an act of care, an act of reciprocity, an act of devotion. As he worked, Kalen's breathing began to steady. The tension in his body eased fraction by fraction. He was watching Elian, his gaze intense, stripped of all its former coldness. He was seeing him, truly seeing him. Not as an asset, not as a weapon, but as a person who was choosing, against all logic, to help him. When Elian finished, he sat back on his heels, his energy spent. The silence of the arboretum settled around them, a soft green and blue peace. It was punctuated only by the drip of rain from the shattered dome. "Elian," Kalen said. His voice was a low, rough whisper. It was the first time he had used a name, not a designation, not a title, a name. Elian had read it on his own datapad once, a forgotten piece of data from his Genesis files. He had never heard it spoken aloud. Hearing it now, in this man's voice, felt like a quiet cataclysm. It felt like being born. He looked at Kalen, and a single tear, hot and unfamiliar, traced a clean path through the dirt on his cheek. The alpha reached out, his movements slow, as if he were afraid of startling a wild creature. His gloved thumb gently brushed the tear away. His touch was no longer brutal or efficient. It was infinitely tender. "I am sorry," Kalen whispered, and the words seemed to be torn from the deepest part of him. "For all of it." Elian simply shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. There were no words for the vast, complex thing that was blooming between them in the green, fungal light of the forgotten sanctuary. It was not forgiveness. It was not gratitude. It was understanding, a shared recognition of their mutual ruin and their shared improbable survival. They were two fugitives, wounded and hunted, with an entire city-state baying for their blood. Their chances of survival were infinitesimal. But here, in the heart of this wild, reclaimed place, surrounded by the evidence that life always finds a way, it felt like enough. Kalian's hand moved from his cheek, his fingers gently tangling in Elian's damp, pale hair. His gaze was full of a raw, aching emotion that Elian had no name for, but that he recognized as the other half of the song his own soul was beginning to sing. The soldier and the asset were dead. They had died in the fire and the rain. In their place, two new beings were taking their first shuddering breaths, Kalen and Elian, and their story, a rebellion written in blood and pheromones, had only just begun. Kalen awoke to the sensation of a delicate weight against his side and the soft, rhythmic puff of breath on his neck. The fever from his wound had broken, leaving behind a profound weakness and a sharp, clarifying ache. He opened his eyes. The arboretum was bathed in the dim, pre-dawn light, a palette of soft greys and deep, velvety greens. Elian was curled asleep beside him, one hand resting on Kalen's chest, as if to reassure himself of the steady beat of his heart. He looked impossibly young, impossibly fragile, his pale face serene in repose. The terror and defiance had smoothed away, leaving behind an unguarded vulnerability that struck Kalen with the force of a physical blow. The air no longer smelled of rain and blood. It smelled of damp earth, of night-blooming flowers with names he would never know, and of Elian. The boy's scent was calm now, a gentle, clean fragrance like fresh linen and the first snow of winter. It was no longer a weapon or a lure. It was simply him, a quiet, intrinsic part of his being. Kalen lay perfectly still, watching him breathe. The last vestiges of his conditioning, the final, stubborn ghosts of the Citadel's doctrine, dissolved in the quiet intimacy of the moment. He had been forged in a crucible of discipline, taught that emotion was a weakness, that connection was a vulnerability to be excised. His entire life had been a testament to that belief. He had been the perfect soldier, the perfect instrument, hollow, empty, and in less than a standard day, this boy, this asset he was supposed to deliver to his death, had systematically dismantled the entire structure of his reality. He had done it not with force, but with a quiet resilience, with a desperate act of self-preservation, with a simple, world-altering act of care. He had shown Kaelin a strength that had nothing to do with violence or obedience, the strength to choose. Kaelin thought of the administrator, of the cold, sterile order she championed, an order that created beings of exquisite sensitivity only to vivisect them for their secrets, an order that trained alphas to be unfeeling monsters and then punished them for the instincts it could not completely erase. It was not order, it was a cancer, a sterile white perfection that consumed all life, all color, all warmth. He looked at the shattered dome above them, where green, living things were breaking through the rigid structure of the past. That was what Elian had done to him. He had broken through the dome of his conditioning and let the wild, unpredictable, terrifying beauty of life back in. A profound, aching tenderness filled him, an emotion so vast and powerful it threatened to break him all over again. But this time, in the breaking, he knew he would be made whole. He was a traitor, a fugitive, a man with a death sentence on his head, and he had never felt more alive. He had never felt more free. Elian stirred, his grey eyes fluttering open. They focused on Kaelin's face, and for a moment, a flicker of the old, ingrained fear returned. Then it softened, replaced by a look of quiet recognition, a fragile trust. "You are awake," he whispered, his voice soft with sleep. "Your fever is gone." "Thanks to you," Kaelin said, his own voice raspy. He reached up, his hand settling on Elian's shoulder. "You saved my life." Elian looked down, a faint flush coloring his pale cheeks. "You saved mine first." "It was my mission," Kaelin said, and saw the boy flinch, the old hurt resurfacing. He tightened his grip slightly, forcing Elian to meet his gaze. "But it is not my mission anymore. You are not my mission." He searched for the words he had never been taught, for feelings he had never been allowed to have. "I chose to protect you, Elian, not the asset. You." The name, his name, was still a marvel. Elian leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement that was a universe of acceptance. They stayed like that for a long time, the silence between them no longer a void of tension, but a space of shared understanding. Eventually, the demands of their bodies intruded. Hunger, thirst, the need to move. Elian, with an instinct born of his heightened senses, found a clean spring bubbling up from between ancient flagstones and large, edible-looking fungi growing on a fallen log. They ate in silence, the strange, earthy taste of the food, a communion. It was the first meal Kaelin had ever eaten that hadn't been processed, rationed, and devoid of flavor. It was the first food Elian had ever eaten that he had procured for himself. Every bite was an act of rebellion. After they had regained some strength, they made their way to a high point in the arboretum, a shattered balcony that overlooked the sprawling, monolithic cityscape of the citadel. It rose from the squalor of the undercity like a spike of black ice, a monument to sterile, oppressive power, its peak lost in the low-hanging clouds. It was a cage, and they were finally outside its bars. "What do we do now?" Elian asked, his voice quiet. He stood beside Kaelin, his shoulder brushing against the alpha's arm. He was no longer shivering. "They will not stop hunting us." "I know," Kaelin said. He looked at the citadel, at the place that had been his entire world. He felt no nostalgia, no regret, only a cold, hard resolve. The attack on the transport, it was not random. The administrator mentioned factions, Sentimentalists. Rebels, Elian breathed, the word a foreign concept. They tried to free me. They failed, Kalen stated. But their existence means we are not alone. It means there is a war being fought in the shadows of this city. A war for the very thing they tried to deny in you. A soul. He turned to look at Elian, his dark blue eyes burning with a new, terrifying purpose. He was a weapon, remade and re-aimed. He would no longer be a tool of the oppressors. He would be the blade in their heart. We find them, Kalen said, his voice low and certain. We find these rebels. We give them a weapon they never dreamed of having. And we tear this entire rotten system down, stone by sterile stone. Elian looked from the sour, cold, distant citadel back to the man beside him. He saw the future in Kalen's eyes, a future of struggle, of pain, of improbable odds, a future that was not guaranteed, a future that was theirs to make. It was a terrifying and glorious prospect. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of Kalen's jaw. The Alpha leaned into his touch, his eyes closing for a brief second. A silent acceptance, a pledge. They stood together on the balcony, two escaped ghosts looking back at their prison. The city was a behemoth of steel and light, an empire built on control. But they had something the empire could never understand. They had each other. Kalen's scarred, gloved hand found Ilian's, their fingers intertwining. It was not the hand of a soldier holding an asset. It was the hand of a man holding his entire world, his reason to fight, his hope, his home. The fight was not over. It had just begun.